Hello everyone, welcome to our 14th session in this semester. Today, first of all, I hope that you've had a great week so far, and I wish you a very good morning. I'm sure you'll remember last session at the end of the class, I told you that the Trojan War, uh, thank you very much, Conrad Raimi. I told you that the Trojan War that your friends talked about has a lot more details than was discussed in the previous session. And today, that's basically what I'm going to do at the beginning of the class. I'm going to tell you about some of the most important details of the Trojan War between the Trojans and the Achaeans or the Greeks. And then after we finish talking about some of these details that I do have in mind, we will give the stage to Ms. Mohammadi, and then she will talk about the story of the Odyssey again by Homer, which of course is the return journey from Troy to Greece, and some of the adventures that of course they had to embark on. These characters who had finished the War of Troy had to embark on in order to get back home. But in particular, and I hope that Ms. Mohammadi will talk about this. In particular, we are going to talk about Odysseus, one of the wisest and bravest of the Greek soldiers and commanders in the Trojan War, and how he was lost and stranded on the sea for so many years, and how his wife and son were waiting for him back home, and how he tried all his best to find his way home because he knew that he had to get back to his country before it would become a chaotic situation. So that's what we will be talking about in the second half of the class. In the first half of the class, I'm going to talk about the Trojan War. I'm not going to tell you a lot of details because we talked about most of them last session. So what I'm going to do is just very, very briefly mention the topics and the details that we also talked about in the previous session. But then when we come to a new kind of detail, which we skipped last session, I will give you a little more details about, some more details about it. So without further ado, without wasting any more time, let us begin talking about the Trojan War. Again, if you remember, we said that the Trojan War happened because of a fight between some of the goddesses. But let's take a few steps back because there's also another fascinating story which is relevant to the Trojan War. And yes, we know that the Trojan War is a legend, which means that it has a relationship to history, which means that the Trojan War might have happened in history. But even so, we still have the presence of the gods in this story. And so this is a kind of story in which mythology is connected with the legend. So just keep in mind that the gods are also present in this kind of mythology. And the first story of the gods, which is relevant to our analysis of the Trojan War, is of course the story of Leda and the swan. Now, Leda was a lady in Greek mythology, and she was already married, but she was beautiful. She was married to the king of Sparta, and she was really beautiful, and so Zeus again fell in love with her. Now, Zeus could not approach Leda in his form as a god because, well, obviously no human being could look at Zeus in his full power without being burnt. So what Zeus did is he turned himself into a swan, and then he approached Leda in the form of a swan and then mated with Leda. And then they lay two eggs, okay? So there are two eggs, and out of those two eggs, some children come out. The daughters who are born are important for us. The first one is Helen, and we know that the story of the Trojan War all started because of Helen. And then we have Clytemnestra, another daughter of Zeus, who's also very important. Why? Because Clytemnestra gets married or marries Agamemnon, and Agamemnon is the most important Greek commander in the Trojan War. So that's why these two daughters are important in the story of the Trojan War. So when you think about the Trojan War, this story of Leda and the Swan is also important for us. So the daughters of Zeus and Leda are Clytemnestra and, of course, Helen. So as I said, Clytemnestra becomes the wife of Agamemnon, the most famous Greek commander. At the beginning of the war, Agamemnon becomes the leader of the Greeks. He collects so many armies from different parts of Greece, and then he leads them to Troy. And then, of course, Helen is also a very, very beautiful woman. So that's the story that I wanted to talk about. But of course, we talked about the origins of the Trojan War. We said that it is important for us to know that, well, Helen was really, really beautiful. She was probably the most beautiful of the women who were present within the context of the Trojan War. And of course, when Paris or Alexander seduces Helen and steals Helen from her husband, Menelaus, the Trojan War kind of begins. And we know how that goes. So we said that we talked about the story. I'm not going into details anymore. But there was just this kind of ceremony and wedding for the gods. And then Ares is also present in this ceremony. He was not invited. But Ares puts an apple on the table on which this sentence has been written. This phrase has been written, for the most beautiful. And then Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all fight over who the most beautiful of the goddesses is. And then Zeus sends them to Paris, and the judgment of Paris is what we talked about last session. And now Paris has to decide which one of them is the most beautiful. And then, of course, as a gift for choosing Aphrodite, he is given Helen. Now, but we know that Helen was married, right? And that begins the Trojan War, because Paris steals Helen, and then her husband, Menelaus, is angry. He goes to his brother. Who is the brother? Agamemnon. So this is the story. Agamemnon and Menelaus are brothers. They marry two sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra. And that's why when Helen is stolen, Menelaus goes to his brother and says, hey, my wife was stolen and I need to take my revenge. I need to bring my wife back. And that's how Agamemnon promises to help Menelaus bring his wife back. That's how he collects the army. Now, another important detail for you to know are the commanders and the leaders of the war. So we're going to talk about the Greek commanders. We're also going to talk about the Troy and the Trojan commanders. On the Trojan side, of course, there are so many commanders, but we're only focusing on the most important ones. Well, of course, we have Priam and Hecuba, who are the father and the parents of Hector, and of course Paris, and so they are really, really important for us. We have Paris himself as one of the commanders who started the war in the first place. Then, of course, we have Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors. And he's, of course, married to Andromache, and his son is Astyanax. So, and then we have Aeneas, and we talked about Aeneas last session. I will talk about Aeneas next week, of course, when we talk about the story of the creation of the Roman Empire. So Aeneas is the leader of the new Rome. He is the only, not the only, but the most important Trojan to survive the war, because everyone else just passes away. Everyone else is killed on the battlefield or when the Greeks attack this city finally. However, Aeneas escapes, and he will later on go to modern Italy and establish the Roman Empire. So these are some of the most important leaders on the Trojan side. The Achaeans or the Greek leaders are also important for us, so I'm just going to briefly go through them. Of course, Agamemnon is, as I said, the most prominent leader at the beginning of the war. And the reason why I am focusing and I'm repeating myself as the greatest warrior at the beginning of the war is that when they go to the war, suddenly Agamemnon becomes this kind of ridiculous leader who betrays his own people, who defies the law of the gods. And so we sometimes blame them for being an incompetent leader, a leader who did not have any leadership qualities when time needed, when it was time for him to prove himself. So Agamemnon was the lord of men, the greatest in prestige among the Greeks, and of course he's present in most of the book because he fights with Achilles, and Achilles is the best of the Greek warriors. But he fights with Achilles, and because of his fight, he steals Achilles' woman. And because of that, Achilles says, okay, I'm not going to do the war anymore. And because of that, so many Greeks die. And that's why we say that Agamemnon at the beginning of the war is extremely important. But unfortunately, throughout the story of the Trojan War, he just does not prove himself. So that's Agamemnon. And then I have brought the description of the Agamemnon for you in the Iliad. So you can see when the Trojans look at the army of the Greeks, they ask, hey, and they bring Helen. Because Helen knows them. They bring Helen. Helen is already in Troy. They bring Helen, Helen starts introducing all of those commanders to the Trojan side. And then when they ask Helen, hey, tell me the name of this mighty man, whoever he is of the Greeks, a man valiant and great, then Helen answers, this is the son of Atreus, Agamemnon, ruler of a broad kingdom, both a noble king and a strong warrior. He was my husband's brother. And then he goes on describing how great Agamemnon is. There are other commanders as well. Menelaus is another Greek commander who's important for us because his wife was stolen. Helen was his wife. It's also important. Diomedes, another important Greek. We have Ajax. And don't forget, guys and girls, that we have two different Ajaxes in the Trojan War. Ajax the Greater and Ajax the Lesser. So we have two Ajax with who are two different people with different parents. But Ajax the Greater is important for us because he was extremely courageous and he was second only to Achilles. So in terms of the warriors, not the commanders, in terms of the warriors, Achilles was undoubtedly the champion among the Greeks. He was the fastest, he was the strongest, he was the most valiant and the bravest. And then second to him is, of course, Ajax. Okay, so that's it. And then we have Odysseus, of course. Odysseus is the wisest of the Greeks. So we have all of these commanders who each represent something in the story. One of them is the bravest, one of them is the wisest. So Odysseus represents the wisest of the Greeks. He's also a fantastic warrior, by the way, but he is the greatest in terms of thinking and making beautiful speeches to persuade the Greek army to do this or to do that. So those are some of the things that you have to know about. So he is, as we said, the wisest of the Greeks. He was great in counsel. He was great in speech. And that's it. The Trojan War couldn't have been won without the counsel of Odysseus. So let me just say that. We will talk about Odysseus in the next part of today's session. Then, of course, we have the one and only Achilles. All of us know Achilles. He was the son of Thetis. You remember at the beginning of our class when we were talking, at the beginning of the semester, when we were talking about Greek mythology and the Zeus's rise to power, we heard about a prophecy about the future that Zeus avoided mating with Thetis because he knew that if he mated with Thetis, who was a nymph, a sea goddess, his son would be greater than him. And that's why Zeus said, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to approach Thetis. But the prophecy came true when Thetis and Peleus had a son. And then this Achilles became really, really greater than Zeus himself. And just don't forget that the Iliad by Homer is actually the story of Achilles. It's not about all of the Trojan War. It's the story of how Achilles transforms into a better person before he dies. Now, Achilles was invincible, ruin tanmud. Why? Because his mom, Thetis, had put him into a river which had made him untouchable. Unfortunately, the only part of his body which was not dipped into that river, into that magic water, which would make your body like a shield that nothing could inflict any wounds on, the only part which was not put into that was his heel. And that's why today we have an expression in English called the Achilles heel, nokte zaf, pashna ashil. That's the only part of Achilles which was not dipped into the river to make him completely. And of course, there was also a prophecy about Achilles, because we will see that in the Iliad, he confesses that he knows his fate. And that's the most fascinating part about him. He knows he's going to die young. He knows he's going to die in the war, but he starts fighting and he continues fighting anyway. So that's what makes him the greatest of all the Greeks. We have Phoenix and Patroclus. Patroclus is important for us because he was a close friend of Achilles. And the fact is that I told you a few minutes ago that there was a quarrel, a conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles, which of course forced Achilles to withdraw from the war. He said, I'm not going to participate in the war because Agamemnon has stolen my women. The only thing which brought Achilles back to the front of the war was the death of his best friend Patroclus by Hector, the greatest of the Trojan commanders. Okay, so let's see what happens. We have the judgment of Paris. I introduced the commanders. Now let's talk about what happens, how the war begins. So this is unfortunately a very sad story which has a lot of sacrifices in it. So at the beginning of it, as we said, we have the judgment of Paris, and then after that, Menelaus seeks revenge. And his brother, Agamemnon, promises him that he would take the whole Achaean army to Troy to bring back Helen. When all of them gather at the sea and they want to start the journey towards Troy, unfortunately, all of the winds are against them, so they cannot start sailing towards Troy.
At this part, we have another fascinating story in Greek mythology, the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Now, Iphigenia is the daughter of Agamemnon, the commander that we talked about. Now, Agamemnon already knows that the reason why they cannot start the war is because Artemis is performing some tricks on them by making all of the winds run against them. And so Agamemnon starts realizing that he needs to make a sacrifice to Artemis so that the winds start blowing in their favor and they can start the war. So unfortunately, some soldiers go to Iphigenia's tent or house, and then they say, hey, your father Agamemnon wants to talk to you and he wants you to marry Achilles. And well, Iphigenia is very, very fascinated by the offer. She goes to her father, but unfortunately she is sacrificed and she's killed so that the winds can look favorably on the Greek army. And unfortunately, we have this sacrifice at the beginning of the story, the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Now, it is interesting that Lucretius, who is a Roman poet, talks about the brutality of this because, well, he was a Roman poet, right? So he was attacking the Athenians and he was saying that, hey, look what ridiculous things men will do in the name of religion. And so that's what he says in his book by talking about, the name of the book is De Rerum Natura. He talks about the stupidity of the Greeks who sacrificed the commander, Agamemnon, who sacrificed his own daughter just to sail to Greece to save another woman. And so this last line is actually very fascinating. And then Lucretius says, such are the monstrous evils to which religion could lead. And he's attacking the Greeks and their religion of worshipping the gods of Olympian gods, of course. On the way to Troy, and then of course the winds start blowing in their favor, and then on the way to Troy, there are so many stories which happen, which are fascinating. So for example, one of them is that Achilles wounds Telephos, just a normal guy. But then, because Achilles' spear is a very special kind of spear, so nobody can heal Telephos except for Achilles himself. And so Achilles shows a kind of, shows a kind of pity towards Telephos, and of course cures him because he knows that he has a wife and daughter, and then he has to go back to his family, and then he was innocent. So we have so many stories about Achilles because, again, don't forget that the Iliad by Homer is the story of Achilles. And so here and there we have so many different stories which try to show different aspects of the character of Achilles for us. And of course, we have these two famous Greeks who are the first people killed in the war, because as soon as they reach Troy, Hector, the greatest warrior for the Trojans, kills two Athenians because he knows that the Greeks are there for war and bloodshed. And so these names are also important for us because these are the first people who are killed in the Trojan War. Now, as I told you, in the Iliad, we have the story of Achilles. And part of that fascinating story is the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. But before that, I have to tell you something else, that the story of the Iliad by Homer is not about all of the Trojan War. No, we don't have the beginning of the war, all of those like 6 or 7 or 8 years at the beginning of the war. And well, we do have some summaries in some other books of what happened in the Trojan War. Now, we have the story at the beginning of the ninth year and the final year of it. And so there is a quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. What is the quarrel about? The quarrel is that before they attack the city of Troy, the Achaeans and the Greeks have to fight some of the allies of Troy, some of the other cities near Troy who are the allies of Troy, and they attack the Greeks to stop them. And when Achilles, as a great soldier, kills all of those, soldiers from other cities near Troy, they take slaves. This was a tradition. They really took the women as slaves. Now Achilles and Agamemnon have a fight over one of them. Anyway, finally, Achilles falls in love with one of the women, but unfortunately Agamemnon steals Briseis, and then that's how Achilles says that enough is enough. I'm not going to continue helping the Greeks because I was in love with this woman, but unfortunately Agamemnon couldn't let me go. And so we have the first beginnings of wrath, of being angry, described in the character of Achilles. And we start realizing that he's very angry. He's not going to be a very calm person in the war, which is important for us. Even when Thetis, his mother, goes to appease him and then say, hey, okay, it's not really something important, you can find other women, he does not agree, and he rejects the offer to go back to the Greek camp. And so this description of Achilles continues for some time. He does not listen to anybody. He's of course he's the perfect embodiment of excellence among the Greeks. We have talked about this before, but just he's also very headstrong. He's also very, by headstrong I mean lajuj and yekdande. So he's not going to listen to anybody. And so you can read this part. All of the commanders on the Greek army go to him and say, hey, Achilles, please come back. We need you. The Trojans are killing us. Without you, we cannot even win the war. But then he doesn't listen to anybody. Even when Odysseus, who's the greatest in speech, who's the wisest, goes to his tent, again, Achilles does not accept the offer. On the other hand, something important is happening. And that important thing which is happening is that, well, of course, in the middle of all of this, we also have a fight between Menelaus, whose wife Helen was stolen, and Paris, who stole Helen. We have this fight, and then Menelaus is about to kill Paris. He's about to kill Paris and finally gets revenge because, well, Paris had stolen his wife. But unfortunately, at the last second, the last minute, Aphrodite, who liked Paris because Paris had chosen her as the most beautiful of the goddesses, rescues Paris, and there, unfortunately, Menelaus cannot kill the person who has stolen his wife. Something else which is happening while Achilles is away is that Hector, the greatest of the Trojan warriors, is preparing himself for the final battle. They say that, hey, the Greeks have been here for 8 years or 9 years. They don't have any water anymore. They don't have any food, any resources anymore. Let's attack them. Now, Hector's wife Andromache keeps warning him, hey, please don't go. I have heard that you're going to be killed. But of course, Hector has to go, of course. And then, well, of course, Hector goes to the war. And this is when, this is a very nice painting in the form of cubism, which represents the final goodbye between Hector and his wife Andromache. When Hector's come to the battlefield, Odysseus is afraid for the Greeks because he knows that Hector is an awesome warrior. So he goes to Achilles and says, Achilles, please help us. But unfortunately, even though he talks very beautifully with Achilles and he tries to persuade him to join the Greek army again, Achilles again turns down the offer because he's still angry with Agamemnon. And so the only thing which happens, which forces Achilles to come back, is of course the death of Patroclus. Now Patroclus goes to fight Hector, but unfortunately he's killed. And the death of Patroclus, who was Achilles' best friend, motivates Achilles to join the Greek army again. And then he asks his mother for a new shield. Don't forget that Achilles had a very, very beautiful shield. But of course his shield, the first shield that he had, was of course thrown away. And that's how he asks his wife for a second shield. And the shield is very interesting because if you Google it, you will see that this shield has everything on it, from descriptions of the world, descriptions of people, pictures of different kinds of wars in history. So it is a microcosm of the whole world. And so the new shield and the new armor by Hephaestus is brought to Achilles, and then Achilles goes and joins the Greek army. Something fascinating which also happens is that Hector finds Achilles' first shield and armor. And unfortunately, he makes the mistake of wearing it. Why is this important for us? Because that shield was specifically designed for Achilles and nobody else could wear it. But unfortunately, Hector wears it. And as soon as he does, all of the gods say that, oh no, he's gonna die, because he shouldn't have worn Achilles' shield. And then Achilles returns and he starts fighting with Hector, the two greatest warriors on the Achaean side and the Trojan side. Now Hector is very clever, so he runs away a lot, and he cannot be killed by Achilles. But unfortunately, Zeus finally says, okay, I think Hector made a mistake by wearing the shield and the armor of Achilles, so I agree that he be killed. And that's why some of the gods and goddesses come to Achilles' help and Hector is killed. Do you remember a few minutes ago I told you about the wrath and the anger of Achilles? This is where Achilles shows his anger. When he finally kills Hector, he ties the feet of Hector to one horse and then drags him all around the battlefield. And by this way, he insults the body of Hector, who had killed his best friend Patroclus. Now, what is important is that, the Iliad by Homer is the story of Achilles, how he becomes the greatest warrior of all. Now, what happens is that Priam, Hector and Paris's father, the king of the Trojans, the old man, sees that his son Hector is being insulted on the battlefield by being dragged all around every day. So one night he puts on a disguise and he goes to the tent of Achilles. He says that I'm going to pay you a ransom, I'm going to pay you a bribe, some money, but please give me my son back. Give me the corpse and the body of Hector so that I can bury him in the ground. And of course, this is the part where Achilles finally becomes a great human being, because he remembers how he felt when his best friend Patroclus had died, and so he understands the predicament and the difficulties that this father is experiencing, and then he agrees to give the corpse back to Priam. And so they reach a kind of understanding. The body of Hector is given back to the father so that he can be buried. Now, what makes Achilles so much fascinating for us is that, as I said, in the Iliad, he says that, I do know that my destiny is to die here, far from my dear father and mother. Even so I shall keep on. I shall not stop until I have hurried the Trojans enough with my warfare. So that is what makes him interesting. Then that Achilles knows his fate. He knows that he has a lot of one weakness, his heel. He doesn't know what it is, but he knows that the prophecy that he's going to be killed. Now Achilles also fights some other allies of the Trojans after killing Hector, specifically the Amazons. The Amazons were those women. They were living in a society in which only women could live, and they came to fight with Achilles. But then, of course, he fought them off. And then finally, we come to the death of Achilles by a simple arrow. And that's the funny part. How Achilles is killed is that a simple arrow, یک تیری رو میزنن به پاشنه پاش, the only part of his body which was not protected. And so, unfortunately, Achilles, the greatest of the warriors, dies. And this is the end of the Iliad. This is the end of the Iliad. The Iliad finishes right here. So we don't know what happens next in the Iliad. But of course, the next book, Odyssey, and some other books which have talked about the Trojan War, talk about the fall of Troy. How? By the wooden horse, which is created by the Greeks. They create a big wooden horse, they hide in it, and then as soon as the Trojans believe that the Greeks have retreated, they have gone back to Greece, and they have won the war, they take the wooden horse. They think that it's a gift, it's a sign of truce. And by truce, I mean Atash Bas. Truce. They take the wooden horse inside the confines of the city and they go to sleep, happy that they have won the war. Little do they know that unfortunately there are a lot of Greeks hidden inside the wooden horse, and as soon as they go to bed, the Greeks come out and then they try to kill every single one in the city. And the only important commander who survives is Aeneas. Aeneas takes his father, his wife, and his children and runs away, and then finally, after some years, with the guidance of some of the gods, he goes to modern Rome and becomes the founder of the Roman Empire. And this is the story of the Iliad. Okay, so this is it. This is the Trojan War with a little extra level of details. And I really hope that you enjoyed learning about all of these fascinating details that we do have about the Trojan War. I'll send you the PDF, of course, so that you can read some of the parts of the story which I skipped very quickly. But Trojan War is a fascinating part of our class, and I want you to enjoy reading about it. Now I think my lecture is over. Now we're going to give the stage to Khanum Mohammadi, and then Zohre is going to talk about the Odyssey, the return journey of Odysseus when the war is over in order to go back to his family in Ithaca. Just give me a second. یه چند دقیقه استراحت کنیم بچه ها.